Hiber-Nation 53. Grizzly's Growls presents Stories from the Hiber-Nation. Read by David Grizzly Smith. Wild Animals I Have Known by Ernest Thompson Seton, as read by David Grizzly Smith. Bingo, The Story of My Dog, Part 5. In the autumn of 1884, the shanty at De Winton Farm was closed, and Bingo changed his home to the establishment, that is, to the stable, not the house, of Gordon Wright, our most intimate neighbor. Since the winter of his puppyhood, he had declined to enter a house at any time, excepting during a thunderstorm. Of thunder and guns he had a deep dread. No doubt the fear of the first originated in the second, and that arose from some unpleasant shotgun experiences, the cause of which will be seen. His nightly couch was outside the stable, even during the coldest weather, and it was easy to see he enjoyed to the full the complete nocturnal liberty entailed. Bingo's midnight wanderings extended across the plains for miles. There was plenty of proof of this. Some farmers at very remote points sent word to old Gordon that if he did not keep his dog home nights, they would use the shotgun, and Bingo's terror of firearms would indicate that the threats were not idle. A man living as far away as Petrel said he saw a large black wolf kill a coyote on the snow one winter evening, but afterward he changed his opinion and reckoned it must have been Wright's dog. Whenever the body of a winter-killed ox or horse was exposed, Bingo was sure to repair to it nightly, and driving away the prairie wolves feast to repletion. Sometimes the object of a night foray was merely to maul some distant neighbor's dog, and notwithstanding vengeful threats, there seemed no reason to fear that Bingo breed would die out. One man even vowed he'd seen a prairie wolf accompanied by 3 young ones, which resembled the mother, excepting that they were very large and black, and had a ring of white around the muzzle. Well, true or not as they may be, I know that late in March, while we were out in the sleigh with Bingo trotting behind, a prairie wolf was started from a hollow. Away it went with Bingo in full chase, but the wolf did not greatly exert itself to escape, and within a short distance Bingo was close up, yet, strange to tell, there was no grappling. No fight. Bingo trotted amiably alongside and licked the wolf's nose. We were astounded, and shouted to urge Bingo on. Our shouting and approach several times started the wolf off at speed, and Bingo again pursued until he'd overtaken it, but his gentleness was too obvious. "It's a she-wolf. He won't harm her," I explained as the truth dawned on me. And Gordon said, "Well, I'll be darned." So we called our unwilling dog and drove on. For weeks after this we were annoyed by the depredations of a prairie wolf who killed our chickens, stole pieces of pork from the end of the house, and several times terrified the children by looking into the window of the shanty while the men were away. Against this animal, Bingo seemed to be no safeguard. At length the wolf, a female, was killed. And then Bingo plainly showed his hand by his lasting enmity toward Oliver, the man who did the deed. Part 6. It is wonderful and beautiful how a man and his dog will stick to one another through thick and thin. Butler tells of an undivided Indian tribe in the far north which was all but exterminated by an internecine feud over a dog that belonged to one man and was killed by his neighbor. And among ourselves we have lawsuits, fights, and deadly duels, all pointing the same old moral. Love me, love my dog. One of our neighbors had a very fine hound that he thought the best and dearest dog in the world. I loved him, so I loved his dog. And when one day poor Tan crawled home terribly mangled and died by the door, I joined my threats of vengeance with those of his master, and thenceforth lost no opportunity tracing the miscreant, both by offering rewards and by collecting scraps of evidence. At length it was clear that one of 3 men to the southward had had a hand in the cruel affair. The scent was warming up, and soon we should have been in a position to exact rigorous justice, at least, from the wretch who had murdered poor old Tan. Then something took place which at once changed my mind and led me to believe that the mangling of the old hound was not by any means an unpardonable crime, but indeed, on second thoughts, was rather commendable than otherwise. Gordon's farm lay to the south of us, and while there one day, Gordon Jr., knowing that I was tracking the murderer, took me aside. Looking about furtively, he whispered in tragic tones, "It was Bing done it." And the matter dropped right there. For I confess that from that moment I did all in my power to baffle the justice I had previously striven so hard to further. I had given Bingo away long before, but the feeling of ownership did not die. And of this indissoluble fellowship of dog and man, he was soon to take part in another important illustration. Old Gordon and Oliver were close neighbors and friends. They joined in a contract to cut wood and worked together harmoniously till late on in winter. Then Oliver's old horse died, and he, determining to profit as far as possible, dragged it out on the plain and laid poisoned baits for wolves around it. Alas for poor Bingo! He would lead a wolfish life, though again and again it brought him into wolfish misfortunes. He was as fond of dead horse as any of his wild kindred. That very night, with Wright's own dog, Curly, he visited the carcass. It seemed as though Bing had busied himself chiefly keeping off the wolves, but Curly feasted immoderately. The tracks in the snow told the story of the banquet. Their interruption as the poison began to work, and of the dreadful spasms of pain during the erratic course back home, where Curly, falling in convulsions at Gordon's feet, died in the greatest agony. Love me, love my dog. No explanations or apology were acceptable. It was useless to urge that it was accidental. The long-standing feud between Bingo and Oliver was now remembered as an important sidelight. The wood contract was thrown up, all friendly relations ceased, and to this day there is no county big enough to hold the rival factions which were called at once into existence and to arms by Curly's dying yell. It was months before Bingo really recovered from the poison. We believed indeed that he never again would be the sturdy old-time Bingo. But when spring came, he began to gain strength, and bettering as the grass grew, he was within a few weeks once more in full health and vigor, to be a pride to his friends and a nuisance to his neighbors. Part 7. Changes took me far away from Manitoba, and on my return in 1886, Bingo was still a member of the Wrights household. I thought he would have forgotten me after 2 years' absence, but not so. One day, early in the winter, after having been lost for 48 hours, he crawled home to Wright's with a wolf trap and a heavy log fast to one foot, and the foot frozen to stony hardness. No one had been able to approach to help him, he was so savage, when I, the stranger now, stooped down and laid hold of the trap with one hand and his leg with the other. Instantly, he seized my wrist in his teeth. Without stirring, I said, "Bing, don't you know me?" He had not broken the skin, and at once released his hold and offered no further resistance, although he whined a good deal during the removal of the trap. He still acknowledged me his master, in spite of his change of residence and my long absence, and notwithstanding my surrender of ownership, I still felt that he was my dog. Bing was carried into the house, much against his will, and his frozen foot thawed out. During the rest of the winter he went lame, and 2 of his toes eventually dropped off. But before the return of warm weather, his health and strength were fully restored, and to a casual glance he bore no mark of his dreadful experience in the steel trap. Part 8. During that same winter, I caught many wolves and foxes who did not have Bingo's good luck in escaping the traps, which I kept out right into the spring, for bounties are good even when the fur is not. Kennedy's Plain was always a good trapping ground, because it was unfrequented by men, yet lay between the heavy woods and the settlement. I had been fortunate with the fur here, and late in April rode in on one of my regular rounds. The wolf traps are made of heavy steel and have 2 springs, each of 100 pounds power. They are set in 4s around a buried bait, and after being strongly fastened to concealed logs, are carefully covered in cotton and fine sand so as to be quite invisible. A prairie wolf was caught in one of these. I killed him with a club, and throwing him aside, proceeded to reset the trap as I had done so many 100 times before. All was quickly done. I threw the trap wrench over toward the pony, and seeing some fine sand nearby, I reached out for a handful of it to add a good finish to the setting. Oh, unlucky thought! Oh, mad heedlessness born of long immunity! That fine sand was on the next wolf trap, and in an instant I was a prisoner. Although not wounded, for the traps have no teeth, and my thick trapping gloves deadened the snap, I was firmly caught across the hand, above the knuckles. Not greatly alarmed by this, I tried to reach the trap wrench with my right foot. Stretching out at full length, face downward, I worked myself toward it, making my imprisoned arm as long and straight as possible. I could not see and reach at the same time, but counted on my toe telling me when I touched the little iron key to my fetters. My first effort was a failure. Strain as I might, at the chain my toe struck no metal. I swung slowly around my anchor, but still failed. Then a painfully taken observation showed I was much too far to the west. I set about working around, tapping blindly with my toe to discover the key. Thus, wildly groping with my right foot, I forgot about the other, till there was a sharp clank, and the iron jaws of trap number 2 closed on my left foot. Well, the terrors of the situation did not at first impress me, but I soon found that all my struggles were in vain. I could not get free from either trap or move the traps together, and there I lay, stretched out and firmly staked to the ground. What would become of me now? There was not much danger of freezing, for the cold weather was over. But Kennedy's Plain was never visited by winter woodcutters. No one knew where I'd gone, and unless I could manage to free myself, there was no prospect ahead but to be devoured by wolves or else die of cold and starvation. As I lay there, the red sun went down over the spruce swamp west of the plain, and a shore lark on a gopher mound a few yards off twittered his evening song, just as one had done the night before at our shanty door. And though the numb pains were creeping up my arm, and a deadly chill possessed me, I noticed how long his little ear tufts were, Then my thoughts went to the comfortable supper table at Wright's shanty, and I thought, now they're frying the pork for supper, or just sitting down. My pony still stood as I left him, with his bridle on the ground, patiently waiting to take me home. He did not understand the long delay, and when I called, he ceased nibbling the grass and looked at me in dumb, helpless inquiry. If he would only go home, the empty saddle might tell the tale and bring help. But his very faithfulness kept him waiting hour after hour while I was perishing of cold and hunger. Well, then I remembered how old Gero the trapper had been lost, and in the following spring his comrades found his skeleton held by the leg in a bear trap. I wondered which part of my clothing would show my identity. Then a new thought came to me. This is how a wolf feels when he is trapped. Oh, what misery have I been responsible for? Now I'm to pay for it. Night came on. The prairie wolf howled. The pony pricked up his ears and, walking nearer to me, stood with his head down. Well, then another prairie wolf howled, and another, and I could make out they were gathering in the neighborhood. There I lay, prone and helpless, wondering if it would not be strictly just that they should come and tear me to pieces. I heard them calling for a long time before I realized the dim, shadowy forms were sneaking near. The horse saw them first, and his terrified snort drove them back at first. But they came nearer next time and sat around me on the prairie. Soon, one, bolder than the others, crawled up and tugged at the body of his dead relative. I shouted, and he retreated, growling. The pony ran to a distance in terror. Presently the wolf returned, and after 2 or 3 of these retreats and returns, the body was dragged off and devoured by the rest in minutes. After this they gathered nearer and sat on their haunches to look at me, and the boldest one smelt the rifle and scratched dirt on it. He retreated when I kicked at him with my free foot and shouted, but growing bolder as I grew weaker, he came and snarled right in my face. At this several others snarled and came up closer, and I realized that I was to be devoured by the foe that I most despised, when suddenly, out of the gloom, with a guttural roar, sprang a great black wolf. The prairie wolves scattered like chaff, except the bold one, which, seized by the black newcomer, was in a few moments a draggled corpse, and then, oh horrors, this mighty brute bounded at me, and Bingo, noble Bingo, rubbed his shaggy, panting sides against me and licked my cold face. "Bingo! Bing! Oh, boy! Fetch me the trap wrench!" Away he went, and returned, dragging the rifle, for he knew only that I wanted something. "No, Bing, the trap wrench." Well, this time it was my sash, but at last he brought the wrench, and waggled his tail in joy that it was right. Reaching out my free hand after much difficulty, I unscrewed the pillar nut. The trap fell apart, and my hand was released, and a minute later I was free. Bing brought the pony up, and after a slowly walking to restore the circulation, I was able to mount. Then, slowly at first, but soon at a gallop, with Bingo as herald careering and barking ahead, we set out for home, there to learn that the night before, though never taken on the trapping rounds, the brave dog had acted strangely, whimpering and watching the timber trail, and at last when night came on, in spite of attempts to detain him, he had set out in the gloom, and guided by a knowledge that is beyond us, had reached the spot in time to avenge me, as well as set me free. Staunch old Bing. He was a strange dog. Though his heart was with me, he passed me next day with scarcely a look, but responded with alacrity when little Garden called him to a gopher hunt. And it was so to the end. And to the end he lived the wolfish life that he loved, and never failed to seek the winter-killed horses, and found one again with a poisoned bait, and wolfishly bolted that. Then, feeling the pang, set out, not for rights, but to find me, and reached the door of my shanty, where I should have been. Next day, on returning, I found him dead in the snow, with his head on the sill of the door of his puppyhood's days. My dog to the last, in his heart of hearts. It was my help he sought, and vainly sought, in the hour of his bitterest extremity. Thank you for listening to Stories from the Hiber-Nation. Comment on the website at grizzliesgrowls.com. This program is offered under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license.